Okay, so welcome all. Thank you so much for making the time. If you're in the UK or connected to similar contexts, you're probably in the middle of planning for pre-sessional programs and so on. So thank you for making the time at what is probably for most people, if not everybody, a very busy time of year. So we are five. Thank you, Letitia, for the introductions. We will each say something about ourselves as we go through things. So the basic plan for today then is you're going to hear from me first. I'll give you a few sort of 5-10 minutes of introduction to LCT, just a few key ideas around the framework. And then I'm going to quickly hand over to Sharon, to David, Daniel, and Anna, Anna Vera, sorry. And we're going to have sort of 4 quick snapshots. Each of the people today have used LCT in slightly different ways. There are 3 principal dimensions to LCT at the moment, and we're going to have a look at each of the 3. So hopefully, if you've seen some LCT before, you're going to see some stuff today that you haven't seen before. Then hopefully in about an hour's time, there'll be a chance for us to get into breakout rooms. We're going to do 3 groups, a couple of us in each. The opportunity to maybe pick up some of the things that you've heard about in the case studies, maybe ask some questions. If you're using LCT yourself, the opportunity to just share what's going on with other people in the group. And then we'll come back to me for a brief sort of scaffolded data analysis task to give you an insight into how LCT concepts can be enacted for practice and research. And then that should take us to 2 o'clock or just before, all being well. We'll see if we can keep to time. That's our plan. So starting points then. Legitimation code theory is defined as a multidimensional toolkit for educational research and practice, and we'll nuance that as we go along. Its chief architect is Professor Carl Mayton. He's a Brit, but he's now living and working in Australia, based at the University of Sydney. And Carl, I think everybody who knows him or has met him will agree, is one of the most generous academics that you could meet. Apart from being the sort of tireless architect of the framework, he's also a tireless worker for community and community building and bringing people together to talk about how these concepts can work in practice, how they can work in research. And you may have heard about the balance between knowledge and knowers in LCT, and Carl is really the embodiment of both of those things. He's both about the concepts and the research, but also about the people and the community. So if ever you want to get in touch, Carl is somebody that is very approachable. You can email him, you can ask questions. If you want to ask about the framework, go direct to the maestro. He's always very willing to hear from people. So LCT's principal influences, there are many, but the principal ones are Pierre Bourdieu's field theory and Basil Bernstein's code theory. We're not going to go into any more detail than that today, but I think it's worth mentioning them because the name legitimation code theory embodies those 2 major influences. So the notion of legitimation, which we'll get to in a second, is very much Bourdieu and Bourdieu's view of society and people and actors and power and status and those kinds of things. And code theory comes from Basil Bernstein. So that's why LCT has the name that it does. So in a very real sense for everybody today, and I'm sure for Letitia and for Susie and for anybody else here using it, LCT has really been a game changer for us. For me personally, the focus on knowledge in particular, but also its sociological perspective, really helped me as a fledgling researcher in the first couple of years of my doctorate. Helped me understand the nature of theory itself, types of theory, forms of theory, and it provided the breakthrough for me after 2 years of wandering and searching and really being lost in the wilderness of different theoretical frameworks in particular. As a practitioner, it's given me a completely new lens and a much richer, more nuanced understanding of what disciplines are, how they grow differently, and how they change and develop. It's transformed my view of VAP practice around curriculum structure, materials design, classroom practice, pretty much everything. And so now I think I I'm completely indoctrinated. You know, I see things through an LCT lens very much. Now, if you dive into certain articles and into certain books, it can seem overly technical and complex. There's lots of notation and diagrams that can perhaps be off-putting. But I think this is an important component of the theory. This technicality is precisely because the framework espouses precision, the capacity to enact concepts for real-world problems in precise ways. It espouses a cumulative view of theory building, showing how we can build on concepts to ever more sophisticated generalizations. But it's also a deeply practical framework, a deeply practical theory, and hopefully you'll get a taste of that today from our 4 speakers. We've all been changed as practitioners through working with this, both for research and in our own educational practice. And I think very much both our thinking and practice is infused with ways of thinking enabled by LCT. So in work that might be of interest to the people with us today, to everybody here in EAP, there's been lots of work around student writing. There's work on academic reading and knowledge building coming up. Susie's work that Susie's here today. Curriculum design, assessment and design practice, teacher talk, classroom pedagogy, teacher education, teacher observation, and working with stakeholders beyond EAP. So lots of work going on, and the corpus is building. We have an indicative reading list that I'll share with you towards the end of the session that has these references and lots of others on there, particularly focused for an EAP practitioner audience. So I'll let you have those soon. And I think it's just worth kind of highlighting at the beginning that for us, the best way into this for practitioners is really seeing the concepts in action. So reading some of these practical papers around enactments for educational practice, and then talking to the people that are already having a go. All of us on the call are very happy to be contacted. We can share our emails later. Do get in touch. And the people outside externally are also very contactable. So as I said before, we've got this indicative reference list to come. And also towards the end of the session, I'll show you the LCT website. There's the Centre for Knowledge Building, and please feel free to get in touch with any of us. Okay, so a very brief sort of big picture view of LCT. It's a sociological framework. So I think in the background, it's worth understanding what the big picture is here and how LCT views the world. So the first thing to say is that LCT construes society as relatively autonomous fields of practice within which actors cooperate and compete for status, resources, and legitimacy, some influence of Bourdieu there. And so social practices embody what LCT calls languages of legitimation. So these are messages about what counts, who counts, and they could be of all forms. So we might be talking about dress codes, or we might be talking about rules and regulations. We might be talking about the implicit messages that are embedded in an EAP curriculum about what matters. Is it the language? Is it the text? Is it the disciplinary knowledge building? So these things, these messages may be explicit, but more often they're implicit and embodied in various ways throughout these fields of practice. So LCT is interested in sort of delving beneath the surface of these messages, these languages of legitimation, and understanding what the principles are that generate them. So the deeper, these deeper generative principles that give rise to messages are termed legitimation codes. And there are different species. So there are currently 3 active dimensions. These are specialization, semantics, autonomy, and each explores different organizing principles around messaging systems. And we'll get to those in a second. So in society, in these different fields of practice, we might be talking about an EAP unit, we might be talking about an academic department, we might be talking about a staff room or different communities and practices beyond the academy. Control over these legitimation codes, over these principles, affords power and status. If you know the rules of the game, you're more likely to succeed. And we can think of EAP teachers in the classroom. We can think of students and their academic writing. So there are multiple codes at play within a given field, perhaps different rules of the game or sort of competition for different principles in operation. So, for example, an EAP unit that has one very language-oriented course that's very kind of skills and grammar, and in the same department, perhaps a program that is far more disciplinarily invested, more discipline-specific. Those two things can jostle for status and legitimacy even within the same department. And I'm sure that kind of idea is familiar to many. So there may be multiple codes at play. And so different actors are then jostling for symbolic or social power within these message systems. And so what LCT is interested in is making these principles visible. If we can describe what's actually going on, that's a sort of an important basis for education, for equity, social justice. We need to know what's happening first to then have access to these rules of the game and potentially the means to question, challenge the dominating principles, dominating practices, and perhaps where needed for equity, for social justice, for education, whatever, change those things for the better. So it's about making these things visible first as a basis perhaps then for improving things. So Carl Mayton summarizes this quite neatly. To analyze legitimation codes then is to explore what's possible for whom, when, where, and how, and who is able to define these possibilities when, where, and how. So for me, I think key for EAP is the way that LCT enables us to see knowledge practices. We talk a lot about language, we talk about texts, and we do talk about knowledge as well, but I don't think we have this language for talking about the different forms that knowledge takes and how that interacts with actors, how it shapes curriculums, how it shapes people, how it shapes practices and contexts and so on. And I think one of the really exciting things about LCT is that it gives us this new language. So the plan for today then is to kind of give you a taster session of the principal 3 dimensions: specialization, semantics, and autonomy. I'm going to very briefly define each of those and then pass over to our speakers to give you a little bit more detail on each of these in turn. So specialization is a set of tools, a set of concepts that address primarily questions like what's most valorized in a given practice, and then what or who has status and why. The dimension of semantics is interested in things like how are meanings made? How are meanings made in the classroom, in curriculum, in disciplines? And what are the impacts for cumulative learning, for students, for disciplines, for staff, or whoever? And then the third dimension is autonomy. And the problems addressed here are around where practices or principles come from, and then the purposes to which they are put. And actually, I forgot to mention as I was going along, but you'll see I have these kind of medical images in the background. The purpose of this is Carl Mayton uses the metaphor of understanding the human body in the same way that we might try to understand practices in society, EAP practices. And so in order to understand different aspects of the human body, we can examine it in different ways and through different lenses. So we can use a microscope, we can use an X-ray, we can use an MRI scanner. It's the same body, but we're examining the body through different lenses. And these LCT lenses do something similar. So each of these 3 principal lenses can be used on the same practices, but they give us different perspectives and help us talk about knowledge and knowers, about meaning making, or about principles, practices, and purposes. So across the 3 dimensions, some of the shared questions that get asked are then, well, how do these things, how does meaning making change across individuals, contexts, and over time? Across these dimensions, what then are the effects of what we're describing, what we're finding in practices for knowledge building? What are the effects for actors? What are the effects for access, for participation, for equity, for social justice? And then how might things be different? Can we imagine alternatives? What action could be taken to change these things? And so ultimately, it's about making things better. This is not armchair theorizing. This is not high-level concepts for concept's sake. There's a strong social justice dimension to LCT, and I think that's worth bearing in mind in the background. It has some technicality, it has some precision, but that's, you know, all the better for kind of teasing out what's going on and then helping to make things better for everybody involved. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the broad sort of sociological view and the dimensions. So I'm going to pass over to Sharon now, who will be the first of our snapshot speakers.
Thanks very much, Steve. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Steve, am I just going to tell you when to change my slides? Because I don't have control.
Well, we thought, well, I can kind of see you, so we thought that maybe you could like point in the air and
okay,
like wave.
I'll do that.
Do a royal wave, and I'll look out for your royal wave, and then you don't need to say anything.
I'm not British. I don't know how to do a royal wave, but I'll make a signal. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Sharon Clarence. I'm currently the doctoral training manager at Nottingham Trent University, but I've come to the UK less than a year ago, actually, from Rhodes University in South Africa, and before that, the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and somewhere in the middle there, also University West in Sweden. So I've worked as an academic development practitioner, and I suppose if you really pressed me on what I would call myself as a practitioner, I'd say I'm probably a writing specialist. And I've worked in this space more or less for the last 15 years, starting off with students, running a writing centre, and working with lecturers around academic writing development practices. Oh, the slides went away. I don't actually know what I'm saying without my slides, Steve. There we go. Thank you very much. Right, you've just got to go back a slide. So, and then I moved from there to Rhodes University, where I started working more with postgraduate students, and then because I was on a 0 hours contract, did quite a lot of work with staff at different universities and different disciplines on developing their practices, and did the same kind of thing in Sweden, and now in the UK I'm working with doctoral candidates and supervisors. So especially in the South African context, which is the one I know the best, a lot of my practice ended up being in universities that were trying to develop different ways of doing teaching and learning, but were really unable to speak from a perspective of understanding that there were different kinds of things going on in different disciplines, and that they needed different kinds of things. So there was a lot of one size fits all types of development. There was lots of show and tell, tips for teachers type development around different aspects of the curriculum, assessment and pedagogy. And so what happened was there were a lot of lecturers I worked with as an academic developer in different disciplines who were just really angry about a lot of this. They were quite frustrated. They felt alienated by a lot of these practices, and some who didn't feel alienated at all and completely loved them. So my own PhD research, which I finished at the end of 2013, actually came out of this sense of I don't know how to help because I don't have a language with which to help them see what it is that I think that they might be mad about. And I kept talking about a gap. There's a gap between what I'm doing and what this is, and I don't know how to get there. And so I turned to first Basil Bernstein's work, and then through that legitimation code theory, which gave me an incredibly powerful language to which to actually help my colleagues think differently and help me think differently about who I was and my role. So you can change slides. So initially, I used both dimensions of specialization and semantics in my work, but I'm just going to talk about specialization because this was the one that was really powerful for the case study that I want to talk about. And essentially, as Steve has said, it's a set of tools and concepts that focus on making visible what Maton calls the social symbolic underpinnings of practices. So who is actually given status in this field and why, and what is given status in this field and why. So we're looking at the people who are engaged in the practices and that are being specialized by those practices, which we would call the knowers. And we're looking at the stuff that they're working on and that they're specializing and that is being specialized, which is what we then could think of broadly speaking as the knowledge. So very simply put, all practices are orientated towards people and towards, so knowers, and towards the things that people work on, so the knowledges. And these knowledges are obviously not all text-based knowledges. practice, principled knowledge, craft knowledge, all of these kinds of things can be included in that notion of knowledge. So what specialization kind of says is in every single set of practices, there are both of these things. There's always knowledge and there's always knowers. But when we're looking, and now we're thinking as educators or as academic developers or as literacy specialists, when we're thinking, how do we actually help students get access to this? How do we help them learn what we need them to learn? How do we help them become successful? It's very seldom the case that we want them equally to focus on both what is being legitimated and who is being legitimated, or what and who are being specialized. So it's very seldom the case that they're both equally important and equally emphasized as the basis for success. More often than not, it's the case that one is the basis for success over the other. So while both dimensions are always present in all practices, what I've seen in my work using these kinds of tools is that practices are usually more specifically or more deeply oriented to one over the other. And that actually drives your curriculum and your pedagogy and your assessment. And it's important to see this because it's important also to understand then how to interpret university policy and how to fit yourself into different kinds of frameworks and how to speak back to some of those frameworks when they try to push you in the wrong sorts of directions. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the nuts and bolts and then talk about my case study, which will hopefully make this clear. So you can go on. Right. So I don't want to go too much into this, but I do want to give you some of the actual theory because I do think knowing how this works in terms of its precision is important. So essentially in this dimension, we talk about epistemic relations and social relations that are along the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. In this, what Carl Maiden uses Cartesian planes to conceptualize the different sets of underpinning, what would you call them? I don't even know now. The underpinnings of the different dimensions, if you put it like that. So epistemic relations relates to knowledge. So when the epistemic relations are stronger, what we're then saying is knowledge is quite important in this context, specializing particular ways of doing things or procedures or specific kinds of principled knowledge. And when the epistemic relations are weaker, what we're kind of saying is knowledge is perhaps a bit less important as a basis of legitimate participation or achievement. And then we have social relations, which relates to the knowers. So when these are weaker, what we're saying is it doesn't really matter who you're becoming. You know, that's not really the basis of specialization here. You are being specialized, but that's not what makes you successful. And where the social relations are stronger, we're saying actually who you're becoming as a specialized knower really is quite important as a basis for legitimate participation here. So the four codes then become, if you put these different epistemic and social relations together in their stronger and weaker forms, they become kind of like a shorthand for saying the basis for successful participation in this set of practices is being specialized both in terms of what you know and who you are, or perhaps it's more about what you know and less about who you are. It's more about who you are and less about what you know. So obviously you don't kind of think of these as boxes. These are continua, and Carl's very clear on the fact that you can have multiple different kinds of positions. And so in one curriculum, you can have 17 different dots in one quadrant, and some of them will move you closer to the middle or away from the middle. So it's a really useful, quite fine-grained tool for thinking about things, but you can also use it quite gently to sort of say, I think what's going on here is a bit knowery and what's going on here is a bit knowledgey. And that's quite a nice way to use it for staff development. So last slide, and then I'm done. So in my case study, what was really useful, and this is sort of touched on in my PhD research, but it actually came out of the practice, was that I was working with lecturers in law and I was working with lecturers in political science on two completely different projects, and they both very kindly agreed to participate in my PhD project. But outside of that, there was a lot of political things, a lot of political stuff going on at the university at that time, because the director of teaching and learning had embraced curriculum alignment, which John Biggs popularized or theorized, and this was being applied in a very particular kind of way, and some disciplines and departments and faculties just loved it and found it made complete sense for how they were thinking, and others really battled. And so they were called troublemakers. In one meeting I sat in on, some of the lecturers who'd complained were being called the vocal minority. And so what was happening is that they were kind of saying, I don't understand why I have to do this. Why am I being made to do this? I have my own understandings of teaching and learning. I have my own understandings of what we're supposed to be doing here. I don't fit into this practice. And Sarah Howard found something quite similar in research she did in New South Wales, where digital technologies were being adopted in the classroom, and some teachers thought, this is fantastic, and loved it. And other teachers were like, I don't know how to use this. This doesn't make sense for me. And so specialization has been really useful for actually, what I did was I was able to then look at their teaching practices, look at their curriculum documents, look at how they talked about themselves and how they talked about what they were doing, look at, especially in the case of law, the professional field. And I was able to go back to them and say, well, you know, what you're doing, your set of practices represent NOAA code, and this is what that means. So for political science, they're very concerned with specializing NOAAs. What the knowledge is not the basis for success. You can learn all the theories you like, but if you don't know how to make good, clear arguments with clear evidence and be persuasive and be critical in particular kinds of ways, you're not going to be successful. Whereas the set of practices that I was able to observe in law really represented a knowledge code. So they were kind of saying, you actually need to know the procedures, and they're not multiple procedures. There's certain ways of doing things. And if you don't know how to do things like this, you can't be a successful lawyer. So who you are as a specialized knower is less important than the knowledge that you have and how you work with that knowledge. And so being able to go back to them with characterizing their disciplines in these ways and getting feedback, and they really sparked something in them. They were like, yes, that's what we're doing. That's what we're about. Oh my goodness. Okay, yes, that makes sense. So what does this mean? What do I do now? And we were able to have such different kinds of conversations about their curriculum, about their assessment, about the writing tasks they were setting their students and how they were assessing them. But more importantly for them, they were also able to then see the university processes as a kind of relativist code in relation to what they were doing. So it was just a sort of empty container for them. But what was then valuable was they were able to then say, oh, okay, so this is how I could actually make sense of that process and speak back to it, rather than just going, that's not for me, I refuse to do it. So there were two levels on which work, both for their local sort of teaching and learning and assessment and pedagogy, which was very empowering, and also for them, how they related to the wider university practices. So that's more than my 10 minutes. I'm going to stop there. And if people have questions, they're more than welcome to seek me out later and ask. Thank you.
Fantastic. David.
Yeah. Hi, yes, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so thanks for letting me talk today. So the context of my talk is based around the design and teaching of an in-sessional EAP module to students studying the discipline of international relations. So my focus is on sort of research and writing practices at a sort of a textual level, textual analysis. I also carried out a research project into learning transfer to see if these students I was teaching were able to transfer taught features of semantic gravity to support their writing in other modules and other assignments they were doing. So in essence, I was looking to recognise whether cumulative knowledge building, sort of form of transfer as I understood it, was happening because of my teaching interventions. I was inspired by others who had done similar things, like Steve, like Esther, like Letitia. So I was sort of, drawing on that knowledge base that had already come before me. Just to sort of give a brief sort of overview of what my understanding was of the gravity dimension, and apologies to those who probably know this already, but like as has been said before, LCT for me was about sort of knowledge seeing, and also making that knowledge visible to apprentices from specific academic communities. So in the context of my work, semantic gravity, I use that to analyze text in the discipline of international relations and development, and in turn through create semantic wave profiles that students could see, that they were visible, so that they could begin to understand and organise the written work to the expected standards of their discipline. So students were being sort of encouraged to use these profiles, these semantic wave profiles, as a reflective or planning guide in their work. So I think that textual analysis like this is quite key to EAP teaching, as it shows students that there are, differences in the way that discourse communities communicate through written or oral text. As you can see on here, I've borrowed a diagram, a wave profile that Steve created from one of his projects, his work. And this is for the discipline of anthropology. And you can see that the lines mapped in this profile correspond to the knowledge types in the text that contain different strengths of semantic gravity. So the weaker the gravity, the less context dependent on the meaning in the text is noted. So something more theoretical, more abstract that knowledge is. The stronger the gravity, the more context dependent meaning is displayed. So more concrete or actual events or practices. So of course, this, as I understand it, varies depending on the subject area that you're investigating. And so you can see here that Steve's put detail relating to, the type of knowledge that relates to that genre, that discipline itself. So for me, that varied too, and that's what my analysis showed up. So yes, Steve, could you go on to the next slide? Why was LCT a good lens for me to use in my context? So these modules that I mentioned, they were created for international students studying international relations and development. And I worked closely with a liaison from that department to get a sense of the writing requirements for that subject area. So my needs analysis was cooperatively developed, let's say. The students had a high level proficiency, sort of 6.5 to 8 in IELTS, if you're familiar with that. And I made sure that the semantic gravity dimension informed the design of different aspects of my curriculum and assessment as well. Now, a part of this needs analysis, so prior to sort of starting teaching this, I looked at around 20 student essays with varying topics in this discipline area, and some with more sort of theoretical kind of views or approaches, others with more empirically driven. But in line with the LCT literature, the higher scoring essays, sort of 60 plus or so, were demonstrating a semantic wave profile that moved regularly between context independent and context dependent knowledge. And this was related to the type of source material that was being integrated and discussed. So the waves were focused on specific points that would feed into a more sort of general thesis statement or overarching argument. There weren't always sort of neat waves all the time, but there was enough to find a generalizable pattern that could have teaching applicability to my context. So I discussed these ideas with this liaison academic, and it gave me confidence to think that this was a way to view knowledge practices in that subject area. It's also important to note that the tutor feedback that I read whilst analysing these essays indicated the rather sort of entrenched but perhaps expected knowledge blindness, and that's another key term that comes up in the literature. So comments like, you need to develop your ideas more, you need to show more critical analysis, you need to provide more thorough explanations of your evidence. And in essence, these were just sort of words without a framework to visualize them. And that's why I felt that maybe semantic gravity could be an important tool to help students sort of visualize this knowledge, to address this blindness. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah. So basically, just a snapshot here of some of the things I did. I developed some materials to teach semantic gravity to students, to make them aware of its use as a planning and reflective tool for their essay writing development. So I used exemplar essays from previous years, set questions to help them pick apart the text, and then to help them to recognize what constitutes context-dependent knowledge, and how that shifted in movement across sections of the text, and then to map that to a semantic wave profile. I also, showed them how, if some parts of the text were omitted, what the wave would look like, i.e. flatlining in different ways. And also included, different activities where students sort of practice drawing, wave based on text that they were reading. So this was, an important exercises that I integrated. Another thing I did for this module, if you go to the next slide, Steve, that would be good. This was an assessment task that kind of linked into some of the work from the module, where I got students to take a sort of security-based case study, conflict, and to analyze it from a particular theoretical perspective that the students were familiar with, and then to sort of, enable them to practice composing, written text that was based on the teaching from that module that we've done so far. So this was another way to, consolidate some of that teaching. So what else have I done? So what came from this? So yeah, the next slide shows some details of an actual research project that I did. So I'm quite reflective in my practice, quite keen to evaluate the work that I do as I do it, and to sort of get a sense of how useful, how effective my approaches are, and whether students are able to apply this knowledge of semantic gravity beyond the remit of the teaching context that I have. And so I carried out this action research project looking to see if students were able to transfer taught features of semantic gravity from my module outside of this to the writing contexts for their other core modules. And so I interviewed students, I analysed essays that they had completed to get a sense of how they were applying and whether they could or not. And that led to some interesting results, which kind of fed back into my own teaching of the subsequent iterations of my module, which enabled me to differentiate knowledge types with more detail, to create what Matten calls more precision, perhaps within translation devices. So that has been useful. I mean, some of the other commentary that the students made related more to sort of the general ideas about transferring, knowledge from one context to another, and that kind of connected to ideas perhaps relating to the structural constraints of the module in which I was operating, its bolt-on capacity. So, that led to other thoughts and sort of hypotheses about potential ways of developing this with more embedded practice. So yeah, so that's what I did. I hope that's 10 minutes.
Thanks so much, David. Okay, so in this whirlwind tour, then we've met some specialization, we've met some semantics, and then I'm now going to pass over to Daniel, who will tell you briefly about the most. It's been around for a while, but in terms of development of ideas, it's the most recent of the LCT dimensions to receive some attention, and that's autonomy. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Sharon and David for bringing us into the world of LCT and looking at those dimensions. So I'm very lucky to have been in Sydney over 10 years ago for one of Carl's first lecture series, which is where I first came across LCT. So I was studying applied linguistics at Sydney University and was lucky enough to be there at sort of the first of the lecture series. Since that time, it's really influenced so much of my practice. So I've worked in English for specialised purposes, working with migrants. I've worked in EAP and universities. I also call myself an educational linguist, which is often the term that a lot of EAP practitioners call themselves in Australia. I've worked in curriculum. I've worked as an educational designer, and I'm currently a PhD candidate. This is a little quote that I've just sort of adapted just for today to just sort of say that LCT is one of these how did I ever teach without it theories, and it really has changed the way that I see things and the way that I view things. And it can be a bit challenging when you first see it, but as Steve was saying earlier, it's really something you get out there and you have a play with it. Okay, and you talk with people, and there's a really supportive community out of there that's around that's really welcoming and supportive and friendly, and they're really, really useful to talk to bounce ideas off. And together we often do get together and talk about ideas, and it's really, really useful for our practice. Steve. So if you can. So I'm going to talk today about a case study. So I was involved in a project for about 2 years, a bit over, probably about 2 years ago. Yeah, and this was what was called a high stakes collaborative project. So between a big university in Australia and the English Language College where I was working. So I was tasked, I was a project lead, and I had to design literacy support for a number of core units from Master of Professional Accounting. So the Master was chosen because it had a 97% international student number, of which about 90% were Chinese students. So there was a need, or a perceived need, from the university to really support the language and the literacy development of the students. So my role was really to come up with a design framework to design a whole lot of literacy support modules, both online and face-to-face. And so one of the big challenges I had was actually how to balance the expectations of all these different stakeholders, the university itself, the managers from both the university and the college that I worked for, the academics of the subjects, the course coordinators I was working with, and of course the students. So we needed to sort of achieve that buy-in with the students, so the students would actually see the value of what we were doing. So I was constantly trying to work out and negotiate what was it going to use, so what was the content that I was going to include in the literacy support, and also negotiating the objectives of, I've said here, the pilot project, but really the objectives of maybe the individual learning objects that I was making, and also how this may have differed across the different subjects. So within the Master of Professional Accounting, I was working with law, accounting, strategic management, so a whole range of different disciplines with different, what LCT would call different dominant legitimation codes happening. So I used autonomy as a lens to help me start to get a grasp on how I was going to work with all these different stakeholders. So basically the dimension of autonomy explores what makes practices distinctive. And it's the basic premise is that any set of practices has constituents or things or elements that are related together in particular ways. So very simply, we have things that we choose and for particular purposes. So LCT uses a lot of Cartesian planes to talk about the relative strengths. And so a really important thing is that we need to operationalize the concept. So basically what I need to do is to say, okay, only these things or other things, and I need to make it clear which things I'm using. And then I can say, okay, for which purposes? Is it for this specific purposes, or is it for other purposes? Now, once I have these two dimensions defined, then I can say, okay, this is my target. Okay, and so really autonomy, one of the concepts within autonomy is the notion of the target. What am I using and for what purpose? So as part of the challenge that I faced was that a lot of the different stakeholders had very different ideas about what I should be using and the different purposes. So the university, a big challenge for the university was the perception that the students who were finishing the Masters of Professional Accounting were ready for the workplace, were ready for the industry. So there was some pressure that I needed to be teaching professional communication practices to meet the graduate attributes that would then allow the students to go off and sort of, be able to land the jobs that they needed. Alternatively, there was also the academics. They were really focusing on teaching the course content. They were interested in learning the curriculum and the discipline. There were other groups of stakeholders that were sort of talking about, well, we've got to be teaching the literacy practices or the English language skills, and we've got to improve the course results. So you can kind of see here that, you've kind of got the professional, you've kind of got the academic, and you've also got the language and the content sort of tension that comes up as well. And then, of course, there was another thing with the push for online materials. So talking about, as long as it's engaging, we have to engage the students. So here I actually thought, well, the message I was getting was that I can use whatever I want. I can teach anything, but as long as the goal is secure online engagement. So this sort of tool gave me the ability to think about how I could define these different targets. And it's not that one target was the only target. It was defining that there may be multiple competing targets. And as we were saying earlier, as Steve said at the beginning, that you can see these targets as a code or a dominant